Chapter 8: The Failed Shipment. The burner phone lying on the polished marble coffee table vibrated violently, ruining the otherwise perfect silence of the penthouse. Mateo Reyes stared at it. It was exactly 4 a.m. Marco was asleep down the hall. In the highly synchronized, precise world they had built over the last 6 months, burner phones did not ring at 4 a.m. unless the system was actively collapsing. Mateo picked it up. He didn't say a word. "Boss," a frantic, breathy voice whispered through the encrypted signal. It was Santos, the corrupt customs official at the port. "It's gone." Mateo felt the blood in his veins instantly turn to ice. He stood up from the leather sofa and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the neon-lit skyline of Makati. "Define gone, Santos." "The NBI," Santos stammered, his voice laced with panic. "They bypassed the routine perimeter checkpoints. They drove 2 black, unmarked vans straight onto the interior tarmac with a federal warrant. They didn't even ask for a secondary scan. They marched straight to our refrigerated container, cut the seal, and confiscated 400 kilos of product." Mateo closed his eyes. 400 kilos. Uncut. The street value was roughly 600 million pesos. It was the first fully owned container shipment of refined Colombian product they had ever attempted to bring into the country. How did the NBI know exactly which container to hit among thousands of identical metal boxes? Mateo asked, his voice dropping into a deadly calm. Santos hesitated. "Boss, I swear on my mother's life, my guys kept their mouths shut. The NBI didn't search anything else. They walked past a mile of freight, ignored 3 different cartel shipments, and walked directly to your box. Someone gave them the serial numbers." Mateo hung up the phone. Mateo stood still in the darkness, absorbing the heavy blow. He made no sound, nor did he throw the phone against the glass. He simply let the raw mathematical reality of the disaster lock into place. 600 million pesos. But the money wasn't the actual problem. The money could be recovered. The problem was the fatal vulnerability the seizure exposed. Up until tonight, the NBI was blind to their operation. Agent Navarro was a nuisance, blindly asking questions in the slums, but he had no legal access to Marco's encrypted manifests. If Navarro bypassed the customs checkpoint and knew the exact serial number of a dummy container supposedly filled with commercial frozen fish, it meant there was a rat inside the house. Someone operating in the highest tiers of their organization had just traded 600 million pesos of Mateo's product to the federal government in exchange for immunity. Mateo walked down the long, carpeted hall and knocked heavily on the master bedroom door. Marco opened it a moment later, tying a silk robe shut. His eyes were groggy, but the moment he saw Mateo's motionless face, the older man instantly woke up. "What happened?" Marco asked sharply. "Navarro seized the 400-kilo shipment at the port," Mateo said. Marco swore violently in Spanish, turning back into the room to grab a securely locked tablet from his nightstand. 600 million pesos. We have to scramble the dummy accounts. If the NBI traces the manifest back to our shell companies, they'll freeze the casino dividends before breakfast. The accounts are already burned, Mateo said, remaining in the doorway. Santos said the NBI walked straight to our container. They bypassed the entire yard. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Marco froze, his finger hovering over the glowing tablet screen. He looked up at Mateo, the gravity of the situation finally hitting him. A leak. A massive one, Mateo agreed. There were only 4 people alive who knew the shipping manifest serial numbers for tonight's delivery. You. Me. Santos. Marco swallowed hard. And Paolo. Paolo. One of the very first truck drivers Mateo had flipped during his hostile takeover of Salazar's original logistics chain. He had been promoted to their chief port coordinator. He handled all the physical transit routing. "Get dressed," Mateo ordered coldly, turning to walk toward the penthouse elevator. Call June, tell him to meet us at the secondary warehouse in Pasig. And tell him to bring the bolt cutters. The Pasig warehouse smelled of motor oil and rotting river water. When Mateo and Marco stepped inside the dim, unlit space an hour later, June was already waiting for them. Standing in the center of the concrete floor, his hands zip-tied tightly behind his back, was Paolo. The logistics coordinator was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between the three men. Mateo. Boss. Paolo pleaded, his voice cracking as Mateo walked out of the shadows. I swear to God, I didn't say a word. They grabbed me at the toll booth on my way home. They threw me in a van and threatened my kids. Mateo didn't speak. He pulled up a metal folding chair and sat down directly in front of Paolo. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward under the single swinging yellow bulb. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Paolo, Mateo said, his voice devoid of anger. It sounded like an accountant discussing a mortgage rate. You stole 600 million pesos from me tonight. But I am not going to kill you for the money. Paolo sobbed, falling roughly to his knees on the concrete. Boss, please. I am going to kill you, Mateo continued softly, uninterrupted, because you broke the rules. And if the rest of the street captains hear that the federal government can make my top commanders talk by simply putting them in the back of a van, the entire system collapses. Marco stood by the warehouse doors, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked physically sick. He was perfectly comfortable ordering assassinations through a third party. He was comfortable ruining rival businessmen with blackmail. But executing a man he knew personally, looking the man in the eyes while he begged for his life, rattled the financier to his core. Mateo, Marco stepped forward, his voice a cautious whisper. Maybe we just exile him. Send him to the southern islands. If we murder our chief logistics officer, it's going to cause a panic on the docks. We need those union guys to trust us. Mateo slowly turned his head to look at his mentor. No, Mateo said. Marco flinched. It was the very first time Mateo had openly defied Marco's advice since he had walked into the penthouse months ago. Mateo looked back at June, standing silently behind Paolo in the shadows. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. June wrapped a heavy garrote wire around Paolo's throat and violently secured it. Paolo thrashed wildly for 30 agonizing seconds, kicking his boots desperately against the concrete floor. Mateo watched June's face in the dim light. June's eyes were wide, unblinking, his jaw set not in disgust, but in a horrific, calm satisfaction. He was enjoying it. For a terrifying second, Mateo looked at his oldest friend and thought, what did I create? He had taken a desperate kid from the slums and forged him into a remorseless monster. Mateo immediately forced the realization down, burying it. Standing near the rusted warehouse door, Tomas watched the execution with a growing, cold pit in his stomach. He had known Paolo since they were 10 years old, pushing wooden carts through the dumps. Paolo hadn't betrayed them for greed, he had broken because his kids were threatened. But Mateo showed no mercy. No hesitation. As the silence returning to the warehouse became deafening, Tomas looked at his boss and felt a chilling realization. The boy who had saved them from the slums was disappearing, replaced by something entirely ruthless. Mateo stood up from the metal chair, staring down at the lifeless body of his former captain. For a fraction of a second, the heavy ice in Mateo's chest cracked. He looked at Paolo's face and saw the ghost of a teenager from the Tonda dump sites, a kid who had shared half a bowl of rice with him a decade ago. A sudden, sickening wave of absolute horror clawed its way up Mateo's throat. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He was murdering his own people to protect a rich man's money. But the crack sealed as quickly as it had opened. Survival demanded the monster. Mateo deliberately swallowed the bile, forcing his heart rate back down to a steady, dead baseline until the numbness returned. He looked over at Marco, whose face was pale. The union guys don't need to trust us, Marco, Mateo said, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. They just need to be more terrified of us than they are of Agent Navarro.